This is the forgotten story of the defense of Britain, of an underground resistance movement formed to fight an occupying German army on British soil, of anti-invasion defences which lie broken and abandoned, of secret underground bunkers and plans at the highest level which predicted the worst possible outcome: German occupation. And in the spring of 1940, that seemed inevitable. Within months, obstacles against the invading German army had sprung up. The landscape bristled with barbed wire, pillboxes and anti-aircraft batteries. And if these defences failed, there was a force willing to take the enemy on. Britain's largest ever volunteer army, eager for action against the Nazi invader, the Home Guard. But Dad's army was only ever intended to sap the strength of the initial invasion force. It would have been of limited use once the German army established itself on British soil. One man only too aware of this was Major General Colin Gubbins, one of the Army's top intelligence experts. He had seen what happened when the Germans brutally suppressed much of Europe and was determined that Britain should put up a stiffer resistance. Gubbins formed a secret army to go underground, to kill or be killed, and even to eliminate other Britons who threatened its ability to resist. It was the first time a resistance movement had been set up in advance of enemy occupation. Major Peter Forbes was working in Army intelligence when he was asked by his commanding officer to find potential recruits.
He gave me a very powerful letter to Home Guard commanders that they had to give me anything I wanted without question, and the best of their men. I interviewed them, checked out with the police that there was nothing on them, and then I said, would you be willing to join something which could be very dangerous, but I can't tell you what it is unless you sign the Official Secret Act.
One morning we were paraded and an army officer came out and said, I want volunteers for a very dangerous job. 3 of us stepped forward. I was one of the Salifos. So he said, well, you'll be trained as far as we can train you to come up behind the Germans, and the way he put it was, and play merry hell with them.
He asked us all sorts of questions about our families, what they did, how long we'd lived in the area, did we know our way around, could we catch a rabbit, and things like that.
I said, well, why do you want me? They said, well, because you know the area. You know the whole area. And they said, you should have demonstrated, you know, going out on a night, bang, bang, in the woods. I said, that's it, Jack, because I like to do a bit of poaching. We knew the countryside and the woods and everything very, very well for miles around. So I said, we want you.
So we signed this piece of paper, which we found out afterwards was the Official Secrets Act. And then he said, no, I'll tell you what you've joined. It's a group called the Auxiliary Units.
He said, if you'll agree, you must keep silent for 30 years at least. Tell no one. No one must know what you're doing. And from then on, we began to be trained as guerrilla units.
Although they received similar training to the Home Guard, these resistance fighters belonged to an entirely separate and secret organization.
I think they saw themselves in Paris and the Home Guard as superior. They had been specially picked out, and were doing more interesting things, really.
We knew the Home Guard were having useless parades up and down the streets and mounting guard at 1 or 2 points. It didn't concern us. We were cut off completely from the Home Guard once we joined the guerrilla units.
The most essential skill of any auxiliary was to stay alive as long as possible. And it was here at Coles Hill in Wiltshire that they learned how to conceal themselves from the enemy. Deep in these woods, they were taught how to build underground operational bases, known as OBs, where they would hide in the event of an invasion. Woodland all over the country betrays an occasional trace of these secret hideaways. But sites like these are rapidly fading from the landscape. The Defence of Britain project was set up recently to record them before they vanish completely. This painstaking research was organised by the Council for British Archaeology, whose president is Francis Pryor. He's been investigating the hidden bunkers at Coles Hill with Jeff Devereux, one of the first resistance fighters to be trained here.
Jeff, did they always locate these OBs in woodland?
Almost always. Sometimes there were a few in farmyards and places like that. But obviously it's much easier to camouflage an entrance like this in a woodland than in open ground.
But I mean, looking at this, I mean, I'm told that brickwork's modern so that people don't fall down for sort of health and safety. But what would it have looked like originally in the war?
Well, if you went in through the main entrance, you would pile the leaves up a bit like that. Not too obviously, but then a bit of breeze would scatter them over the top and you'd have a hidden entrance, you know.
Most operational bases were destroyed at the end of the war. This is one of the few that survived.
I tell you what, Jeff, it's fairly restricted entrance, isn't it?
Yes, but you need a blast wall like this, of course.
So that's what that is, blast wall.
Yeah, so if somebody drops a grenade down there, you're protected to some extent.
Most OBs were built like this one, sunk around 15 feet into the ground with a concrete floor and walls of brick and corrugated iron.
And what's that for?
Many were built by the Royal Engineers. The men were brought in especially from other parts of the country, so they couldn't betray the whereabouts of these secret underground hides.
This is the dining room?
The dormitory.
And these over here, were these the beds?
Yes, there were bunks there, double-decker bunks.
And then I noticed in the floor there's a
Yes.
drain goes down the middle.
That's right. That's for surplus water coming in.
But it couldn't have been much fun, though. I mean, standing with running water going down the middle of the floor. I mean, weren't you always tripping up on that?
Yeah, we weren't here for fun, though.
Each operational base was big enough to hold between 6 and 8 men. It contained everything they would need to survive underground and carry out sabotage operations successfully. It would be the only place they could call home should the Germans occupy Britain.
I think we thought that we were probably safer in our underground OBs than fighting on the surface against the invasion. Looking back, I think it was looked upon as a suicide mission, but we didn't feel that at the time.
The men were expected to last only 2 weeks at the very most before being captured or killed.
Tell you what, Jeff, this doesn't look very, very secure, this. I mean, what does it feel like to go back in one?
Well, it brought back feelings of terror, to be honest, because you felt very insecure in there, you know. You couldn't lock any doors or you weren't very well protected.
Around 3,500 men were recruited to the ranks of this secret underground army.
It was intended that we should go underground, lie quiet, let the invasion forces pass over us, and then bob up behind and create as much mayhem as we could.
Our intelligence officer would guide us, advise us, and then he cheerfully said, of course, we wouldn't expect you to be alive at the end of 13 days.
In the summer of 1940, there was still the very real threat of invasion. Barges, heaving with weaponry, lined the French ports, just waiting for Hitler's order to cross the channel. It looked as if these resistance fighters would finally see action.
The other thing was, it was all rather exciting. A ridiculous thing to say now.
On the 7th of September 1940, code word Cromwell swept through the South and East Command. Invasion by the Germans was imminent. Church bells pealed across the land to warn of the impending landing by German troops on British soil. 1.5 million Home Guard immediately mobilized. In Dorset, it was the news that Fred Simpson and his patrol had been expecting and dreading. The memory of that day is still vivid 65 years on.
We were exercising one morning somewhere around here, probably in the heath over there. An officer came along quickly. He said, "Stop what you're doing, stop what you're doing." He said, "We want you to go home at once," he said, "and get all the food. Get all the food you can and come back and go in that hide." So we did. We rushed home. I said to my mother, "I want some food to take away for this weekend." She said, "Whatever for?" I couldn't tell her, could I? We'd signed the Official Secrets Act. I couldn't tell her what I was doing. She said I should be away for a little while. I could have said forever if there was an invasion, but never mind. We all went down in that hole. The last man dragged the bush behind him to stop the hole up. And we stayed there for, it was 2 nights and a day, approximately. I'm not sure about the time of the day or anything like that. The authorities thought the invasion was a mere 12 hours away. And that's what we were waiting for, the enemy. We expected to hear the tramp of any boots over the top or something like that. We didn't know. And suddenly a voice from outside said, "You can come out now, the danger is over."
This time, it was a false alarm. But the threat of invasion was far from over, and the men knew how important it was to be well prepared. While the Home Guard was drilling with broomsticks, the resistance fighters were becoming adept at using the most sophisticated weaponry. This was essential if they were to become effective saboteurs.
We were given all the latest equipment, Tommy guns, Seine guns, rifles with special sights, entirely on Churchill's orders.
They also learned all about fighting dirty. As they were told by one of their instructors, "If you think our methods aren't cricket, remember Hitler doesn't play the game." This fighting knife was standard issue for every guerrilla.
Well, we weren't supposed to go into open combat. The fighting knife wasn't really to fight with, it was just to quietly kill. I think you understand how that happened.
Even now, many of the techniques they learned are second nature to these men.
I'm coming through the wood on patrol. I see a sentry. I have to kill him quickly and silently. So I grab a handful of soil and leaf that I can ram into his mouth to stop him shouting. As I come up behind him, I take the hand and put the dirt in his mouth to stifle him, get him, pull his head to one side and strike hard into the neck.
Sometimes, to carry out an operation successfully, a resistance fighter had to kill. But it wasn't ideal. The last thing he wanted was to draw attention to himself. His success relied on his ability to remain invisible.
The patrols would not have stood a chance in a firefight. We weren't heavily enough armed to firefight a German patrol. In fact, as they said in training, if they see you, you're dead.
If the Nazis had overrun Britain, they would have faced more than just a guerrilla army. An extensive intelligence network with secret underground transmission stations had mushroomed across the country. It was almost as if the Germans were already here.
The network consisted largely of people who were likely to have permission to carry out their activities in normal employment after invasion, such as doctors and milkmen and estate agents and solicitors, people who would have local mobility, and this would enable them to gather intelligence for transmission to army headquarters.
Intelligence gathering in Norfolk was crucial. Its exposed position on the east coast made effective lines of communication a necessity. Even 16-year-old girls like Jill Monk were recruited as agents.
I was really part messenger and part spy, I suppose. Probably the idea was that a teenage girl riding a horse wouldn't be suspected of being anything sinister.
Jill's father and mother had also been recruited to the network as radio operators. As the local GP, her father was an ideal recruit. Jill was trained to identify enemy aircraft, their cargo, and the military insignia worn by German soldiers. She would hone her skills on Allied troops in the area, who had no idea that this seemingly innocent young girl was a spy.
It was great fun trying to gather information from the soldiers, because they were tickled at this girl on a horse coming along, and I'd try and find something to talk about and have a good look at their shoulder flashes so that I could say what regiment they were, and I'd ask them about what guns they'd got and whether they were big ones or little ones. And when I got the information, I went back home, and mother or father got the code sheets out and encoded the information, and then they would send a message through. We didn't know where it went to. It just you spoke into the radio, and that was it.
The methods Jill used to relay information from one point to another could have come from the pages of a spy novel. An agent would leave a message in a secret drop-off point, known as a dead letter drop. Under cover of darkness, Jill would retrieve the message and deliver it to a hidden postbox, usually a piece of drainpipe, leading to an underground radio station. These messages were often placed in tennis balls to enable them to roll down the drainpipe. The operator would then transmit the message to HQ.
It was really a very clever system. Very Heath Robinson, but typically British, I think. Of course, when you dropped your tennis ball down the drainpipe, you didn't know who it was going to, because we weren't allowed to know anybody else who was in the job, because if the Germans had come and we were caught, we couldn't give anybody else away. They could torture us all they liked, but what we didn't know, we couldn't tell them.
In the spring of 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa had begun. Now that Hitler's armies were concentrating all their efforts on the Eastern Front, would the invasion threat finally recede?
That was not seen as a point that took the heat off here at all. Indeed, on a technical point, Hitler didn't ever cancel the planning that was already underway for the invasion of this country. Whether or not it was known at the higher circles that the invasion threat to the United Kingdom was then off, it certainly was not known to the public. And the public included the members of the auxiliary units.
The units intensified their training. 100 new patrols were formed. These guerrillas were better equipped and better armed than ever before. Their mission was to destroy the infrastructure that would be essential to an occupying German army. That included our own airfields and railways. Disrupting German supply lines was a key part of the guerrilla strategy.
I'm placing an explosive charge against this line to cause a breakdown. This is a pressure switch connected to a detonator within the charge. As the train goes across the track, it presses this, which fires a little charge in here. Fuse links into the detonator there. We wedge this under the rail so that it's pretty firm, because we're relying on the movement of the track to ignite the charge. With a sufficient charge, we rupture the rail, and the locomotive is derailed. You never run away from a charge, ever. You always walk, because you could trip over. If you trip over, you're going to be on the ground close to the charge. If you walk, you're watching what you're doing.
Should a sabotage operation go wrong, capture by the enemy was not an option.
If we went out and one of us got hurt, badly hurt, and you couldn't get him back, you had to kill him. You had to make sure that he wasn't captured, because anyone who was captured would be tortured, brutally tortured.
Your colleagues would have been doing you a good service by terminating you.
They would have tortured you for the information, then they would have killed you anyway. So you were going to die anyway. So the best thing to do, of course, was not to be caught alive.
We knew we had self-destruct tablets to kill ourselves if we got in a tight corner. And I think we should have used them.
The instructions were fairly clear. Take one pill if you are injured to reduce the pain. Take 2 pills if you are about to be captured and wish to be able to resist interrogation, and take 3 of these pills if you wish to take your own life.
No surprise then that evading capture was one of the most useful lessons the guerrilla learnt. And if his life depended on it, these were lessons he would never forget.
I surrender. Cameron. I walked towards this guard and I would approach him knowing that I had full advantage, because I could see he was frightened of me. And I keep smiling, and he's confused because he's looking at something that's bewildering him. He's really frightened. So I immediately take the rifle away, and if he pulls the trigger, it's gone. And then I would come over, force down there, force it out of his hand. And then I come round, and he would come upright, surprised. And I would hit him right in there, which would paralyze him. If I hit him hard enough, it would kill him.
Dispensing with the enemy is an unfortunate byproduct of war, and these resistance fighters had no qualms about killing. But what is extraordinary is that these men were also prepared to turn on their own people, on anyone who compromised their security.
We had authority. If we found collaborators in any of the villages around us, to kill them, to shoot them. They were blabbering too much, talking too much to the Germans. The best thing would be shoot them.
That ruthlessness would have been put to the test if the Germans had carried out reprisals against the villagers in response to guerrilla activity.
At that stage of the war, we didn't know that the Germans would take people from the villages and shoot them, because if people from the various villages were being lined up and shot, the men in the trails would have had a very difficult time to know what to do.
Whatever they did to the villages, we would never have stopped. We were fighting not for a few villages. We're doing this for the country. We were trying to save our country.
In the end, the country was saved by other means. And for many years, these resistance fighters kept silent about the lengths to which they'd been willing to go.
We weren't to tell anybody what we'd been doing. We were to go fade away into the distance and disappear. And to remember that we had signed the Official Secrets Act.
Ironically, it was Dad's army who actually saw action, and not this elite guerrilla force. They were the men who defended the country when invasion did come, not by land or sea, but by air.
Thursday at 9 on 4.
Most of Britain's wartime volunteer army saw no action, but when Britain was attacked from the air, there was no shortage of men to volunteer for the most perilous of assignments. These were the Home Guard who manned the anti-aircraft defences.
The atmosphere on the gun site, oh God, it was pretty tensed up. And when you did press the firing lever, it made one hell of a noise.
The noise is unbelievable, especially if you get all 6 guns going at once and you just don't know what's happening. All you can hear is the bang of the gun and the clang of the empty shell case coming out, hitting the concrete, and then all the horrible yellow smoke blowing around you, all cordite fumes. And then there's the next bang, and on it goes.
London was the Luftwaffe's prime target, and the Home Guard played an important role in its defence. In the summer of 1940, in the space of just a few weeks, a bristling ring of anti-aircraft batteries was hastily erected in the south and east of the capital. One of the most strategically important was Shooter's Hill. Night after night, it resounded with the roar of rocket launchers. One of the operators was Home Guardsman John Peters.
The firing of the guns, however effective or ineffective it was a morale booster, because it felt we were striking back. We felt we were contributing to the war effort in an active sense rather than a passive sense.
Shooter's Hill has reverted to the golf club it was before the war. There's little visible evidence of the anti-aircraft site that once stood here. But if you probe hard enough, the remains of these wartime sites aren't that far from the surface. Just a few miles away from Shooter's Hill is Petts Wood Nature Reserve. There's little to suggest that it too played a crucial role in the defence of Britain.
This may look like a rural idyll with beautiful wildflowers and lots of trees, but if you actually stick one of these road spikes into the ground, you hit concrete. There's concrete all around the place here, from roads and from the actual gun emplacements, because this was a major anti-aircraft battery.
There were 6 heavy anti-aircraft guns sited here, which radiated out from a central command post. The trees conceal the fact that the battery was in the middle of a heavily residential area, and that wasn't uncommon on sites like these. 11 men were needed to operate each gun, so you could have up to 66 on the battery at any one time. Here at Petts Wood, the Home Guard supplemented the Royal Artillery. Richard Ewing was one of just 22 Home Guards stationed here during the war. When he signed up, he was barely 17.
One night I walked into the hut and saw a poster saying, "Heavy ACAT wanted." So I went straight in to see the Major. Said I wanted to be put on the list for that. It sounded attractive to me. Big guns, you know. But when we came up and saw them, it was quite a surprise. He said, "Well, I'll put your name forward, but you'll be back here in 6 weeks because you won't pass the training because you're only 5'2" and it's heavy work." But 6 weeks and I managed to prove him wrong. I never went back to see him.
These are not Hollywood sound effects. This is the music they play every night in London.
By spring 1944, there were more than 100,000 Home Guard working on AA batteries.
The Home Guard's main contribution lay in the fact that they released large numbers of regular troops for other duties, especially overseas. And we shouldn't forget that the Home Guard were in the front line while they were working on anti-aircraft batteries. These places could be bombed, were often attacked, and many of them died.
In June 1944, they faced a new challenge. An unexpected weapon which fell from the skies. The V1.
There it goes. The pilotless plane or the flying bomb. Not a legitimate weapon with which to win a war. Just an evil agent of senseless destruction and injury, launched against civilians by an all but defeated bully.
First memory of V1 was coming out of a nightclub in London, just as one of those things fell. And as there hadn't been any bombing from the Germans for quite a time at that time, this was 1944, one was rather surprised. These wretched things were coming over all the time, and you weren't worried as long as the engine was running. But as soon as there was silence, it was a nasty thought, because they were going to come down. One came down just the other side of the building I was in.
What made it worse was not being able to hit back against these lethal weapons.
Coming in lower and faster than we thought. Much lower and much faster. But the Royal Air Force was...
Firing at the V1s, if we damaged them, they would only come down and land on and explode on the houses and that round by. So, second night, we were told not to fire at them.
As morale in the capital plummeted, AA Command grappled with how to neutralize the threat from the V1s.
It's up to us to stop these flying bombs before they can reach London. No effort or exertion will be spared.
This next chapter in the story of the defense of Britain would reveal how an extraordinary triple defense system was implemented in a matter of weeks.
When the V1 started to come over in June 1944, a pre-existing plan was activated to put an enormous number of anti-aircraft guns on the North Downs between their approach tracks and London. There were, within the first month, about 1,500 guns. Additionally, they put about 1,200 barrage balloons behind the guns in the hopes the V1s would hit the cables, and had fighter aircraft operating in the area in front.
But this didn't work. There was the danger of friendly fire, the guns shooting down British aircraft.
After a month, when some V1s had been down, but not as many as they believed they could shoot down, they were switched around. The guns were moved down to the south coast to form a continuous belt between Dover and Littlehampton, and the fighters were moved into the area between the guns and the balloons. So the guns got them first, and the fighters came along second.
When the guns moved to the coast, the Home Guard followed. They had a crucial role to play in augmenting the regulars and keeping the guns firing day and night.
Coastal duty, and that was great fun because you could actually see the V1s coming in and you were firing at them head on. If you got them when they just went down in the sea, didn't do any damage. But if we missed them, then they carried on, and then the RAF took those over.
This anti-aircraft battery near Dover was in the front line against the V1s. It's also one of the best preserved, which makes it worth a closer look by both archaeologists and historians. Now it's just a series of empty concrete bunkers. But more than 60 years ago, it resonated with activity.
Stand by, they're coming over.
Action, all flight acknowledged.
So what went on in here, Colin? Downstairs in the battery is where information was received about enemy aircraft movements. And the commander would be able to plot that and make his own decisions about engagement or not engagement of targets.
And then the information went out to the guns?
Would be sent out to the guns, yes.
Plane range control!
Many in the Home Guard saw action on sites like these. They weren't given the same training as the regulars, but over time they became just as proficient at shooting bombs from the sky.
Down at the coast, we were just as good as the regulars at firing them. There was many we got, you know, you lose count. we were pleased when other regulars that we didn't know, they said they were amazed we were as good as they were. So that pleased us.
Well or foul, night and day, they stood up to this tempestuous enemy like rocks against the sea.
What proportion of planes did they actually shoot down?
It changed over the duration of the war. In 1940, they would be lucky to hit 1% of the aircraft in any one raid, often a lot less than that. By 1944, with the flying bombs, they were hitting 60 or 70% of those seen on any one day.
I mean, that's very successful, isn't it?
Enormously.
In addition, Allied troops on the continent were successfully destroying the launch sites. Finally, it looked as if the V-1 threat was being contained. Then, in September 1944, came another weapon. A weapon that would expose the flaws in our defensive capability. A weapon against which there was no defense. For months, horror stories had been circulating of a secret weapon which would end the war in Germany's favor. A gigantic weapon with a 10-ton warhead, capable of obliterating 50 acres of London in a few seconds.
With the V1, at least you knew you could dive for cover when the thing cut out. With the V2, it was instantaneous.
From the point of view of the defence, the V2 was a completely different proposition from the V1. The V2 approached vertically at a speed of about 3,500 miles per hour, so it just hit London without any kind of warning. You couldn't even see it.
They just went up in a huge arc up into the stratosphere. You might be lucky enough to just happen to see an arc of trail, and otherwise you wouldn't know they were coming.
It was extremely hard to detect on radar in a way that could provide any kind of warning. You certainly couldn't shoot it down, either with an anti-aircraft gun or with an aircraft. So for all practical purposes, against the V2, there was no defence.
Flawed intelligence, which exaggerated the destructive potential of these rockets, brought the government to the brink of panic.
They expected that every day of V2 bombardment, 100,000 people would be made homeless, as well as the tens of thousands who would have died. They worked out that the whole fabric of society in the London area would break down in a week or less. They had no idea what to do.
The final layer in the defence of Britain was the zero option. What to do when everything else has failed. When our guns became powerless against the V2s, running the country from Whitehall no longer seemed an option. Chaos, feared the War Cabinet, would inevitably follow.
Scientists calculated, in fact they miscalculated, but they calculated that these weapons would flatten London within weeks and the government would be impossible.
It looked as if the plan to protect the government and to organize what might be Britain's last stand would have to be implemented. These plans involved the unlikely London suburb of Dollis Hill. Francis Pryor investigates one of the final layers in the defence of Britain.
I know it may not look like much, but this rather drab structure here in northwest London was in fact the emergency war headquarters for the entire country. There's a thin skin of modern brick, then there's an air gap, and then there's 2 foot of reinforced concrete. So if air raids drove Churchill in the War Cabinet out of central London, this is the place they'd have come to. Its code name was Paddock, and it was the first purpose-built, completely bomb-proof war headquarters.
When war broke out, the government and military strategists moved into the cabinet war rooms, but they were far from bomb-proof. Paddock, however, was built to protect against gas attacks and the most powerful German bomb.
There were two underground stories separated by a reinforced concrete floor 5 foot thick. Here there was a steel and concrete blast door which sealed off this floor from the floor below.
The first time Churchill visited this secret underground complex was in September 1940, just after the Blitz began. Suddenly, the prospect of moving to the suburbs seemed more likely. Churchill said, "I think it important that Paddock should be broken in."
That October, the War Cabinet met in this very room. It's empty now, but originally there were tables around the edges and maps on the walls, which were illuminated by those tilted fluorescent lights.
Paddock was never used. The lack of living accommodation convinced Churchill that it should be treated as a last resort citadel. It's lain dormant and abandoned for the last 25 years. But even more drastic plans were made, should V2 attacks annihilate London.
Most important function of government, in the eyes of government, is the preservation of government. Some might think that their highest duty is the protection of their population. But of course, since they are the government, in their eyes that requires the government be protected first. The government planned a series of moves. There would be precautionary moves, colloquially known as the yellow moves. And if events really became serious, there would be the black moves. The seat of government would have to be evacuated. The king would have to go. The control of the armed services would have to go. Parties of civil servants and military officers had been going around the countryside, looking, if you like, for places to hide. The planners alighted on the area of Worcester, and plans were secretly laid to basically nick every country house in sight.
Executing these plans meant involving people who couldn't be allowed to know what they actually were. When he was just 17, Jeff Devereux was recruited to the auxiliary units and found himself playing an unlikely role in the defense of the realm. His intelligence officer explained that his patrol just outside Worcester was one of the first to be set up. But Jeff was never allowed to know exactly why he'd been recruited. He only discovered the wartime significance of the estate he'd grown up in many years later. Worcester was specifically chosen for its distance from the coast and potential aerial bombardment from bases in occupied Europe. It was the very heart of England. Just outside Worcester is one of the most spectacular Elizabethan homes in the country. Madresfield Court was the inspiration behind Evelyn Waugh's most famous novel, Brideshead Revisited. And it was here that the royal family would have come if they'd been forced to flee London.
The plans were laid. All that the owners would have known about it is that one morning a policeman would come to the door and serve them with a requisition notice. It wouldn't even tell the owners of Madresfield Court at that time that it was the king who was going to occupy. That would be a very top secret matter. All they would know was that they had to pack their bags and leave their house.
Jeff Devereux now believes it was more than just coincidence that he was specifically chosen to be a guerrilla.
Yes, this was always a mystery to me. I know the answer now, but I didn't at the time. My family were tenant farmers on the estate, and I suppose that's why I was the first. They said, well, this fellow was born there, he should know if anybody does.
So you were actually selected to protect the royal family?
Well, I didn't know that at the time, of course, but and it wasn't so much protecting them as helping to secure their protection, shall we say.
It was a similar story with other stately homes in the area, which were earmarked for the Prime Minister and the War Cabinet. No one except the highest echelons of government knew anything about it, not then, nor for a long time afterwards.
In the middle of a war, the last thing you want to do is to tell an enemy where your highest leadership or most important national people are going to be. It is absolutely obvious that the nature of these moves would be kept secret, and indeed were kept secret for a very long time after the war ended.
Plans like the Black Move now sound like the plot of an airport novel. Weeds choke the concrete blocks that once formed the defences of this country. The coils of barbed wire have vanished from the beaches, and the pillboxes that remain are gradually crumbling away. It's hard to believe that just 60 years ago, Britain was a fortress, and that huge swathes of the land were under military control. What remains is the memory of those who lived through it, of the men and women who were spies, resistance fighters, and foot soldiers, prepared to lay down their lives to protect Britain.
I would have done anything at all if I could have helped to have kept the Germans back from taking this country. And I would have done anything terrible to do it.
Robert Redford and Brad Pitt star in the espionage thriller Spy Game over on Film 4 in a few minutes. Here on Channel 4 next, it's all about Christmas Eve in ER.